Okay, so me being here is actually a result of another set of lectures that were held in Berlin last year, and the event I was at was called Diagnose in December 2018 in Berlin at the Technical University. And this event was discussing quite a momentous exhibition that happened at that school at the Technical University of Berlin back in 1968. So last year it was 50 years. This exhibition had been held, and this exhibition in 1968, which was called Diagnosis, thank you for moving, it helps, was something that was organized by students, by teachers, by young architects, young professionals, planners in and around the city of Berlin. And what they did back then was they organized this to confront the very hegemonial planning practices of the city of Berlin. So the exhibition back then was critical in particular about the complicity between city planners, architects, politicians, the city authorities, and the building industries. And when I spoke to Carolina, who's not here tonight, I think I meet her in Prague tomorrow. We picked up at precisely this point. No? So we were at this event, which was celebrating or looking back at this exhibition from 1968, was trying to look at what came out of this event, and we got talking about architectural education and what she was doing and I was doing, and so on and so forth. So these conversations with her circled around those issues that were raised now over 50 years ago, and we spoke about how we, as maybe architectural educators, architectural education is maybe still spellbound by the same structures, the same issues, the same concerns as had concerned those people back in 1968. And today still we talk about very often complicity of architects in certain processes. We talk about still about corruption. We talk about corruption between building industries, politicians and others. We're still very critical around and about the educational systems that seem to be stuck in a different century, and that's not the 20th century, but maybe the 19th century. Many courses are still stuck in, and this is something in particular I want to return to during the course of this talk. And within this wider field of critique, I want to speak of my own particular practice. I studied architecture, I did my PhD in architecture, I still teach at a school of architecture, but I also for a very long time lived in the UK, and I was sort of introduced to a sort of critical theory approach. Which doesn't necessarily look at architecture as this sort of solitary thing, but something that is bound by other forces as well, and is essentially part of a social science, a humanities, a broader discourse on how space is made. And yeah, so I want to speak tonight about why certain things matter to me. And I want to speak about how these critiques, the things that matter to me, are then translated also into action. So let's see how that goes. Okay. I start a little bit by talking about who I am and where I come from, in particular this Institute of History and Theory of Architecture in the City at the Technical University in Braunschweig, Brunswick, which I've been based for the past year and a bit. And I then move on to a research project which I started quite a while ago with Jeremy Till, which was not mentioned, Spatial Agency, Other Ways of Doing Architecture. And along the way, I'll talk a bit about the role of architects and spatial planners in a world that I find is dominated by an increasing commodification of space, privatization of public land and assets, in a world that you could be saying should be working towards mitigating multiple crises, the climate crisis being one of those big crises, but also growing inequalities, but isn't really working towards this in a world where architecture has come to occupy very often a position of window dressing. Architects are designing very pretty facades, but very often not much more. And I'm being a bit polemical here, but stay with me for the time being. So dressmaking, beautiful clothes that have no other discernible function than to look pretty and shiny and glossy in a world. Architecture, you could say, has become a very decorative task. And against this, I want to posit this more transformative understanding of what architecture is. This has been mentioned before. An emancipatory understanding of practice, but also education, an understanding of space that challenges these normative ways of doing, and thereby calls also into questions dominant perceptions of what it actually means to be an architect. Does it actually mean to be an architect to design pretty clothes, or does it have something, kind of a different task? And again, this is something that is today, I would say, as relevant as it was yesterday, as relevant as it was 50 years ago. And I won't be too long, so maybe 45 minutes or something like that. I've had a very long journey here, and I've been late as well, which took me even longer, and I hope we can instead have a little bit of a discussion afterwards. Okay, so I'll move to this here, which is also the title of the talk. Architecture schools should be dissolved unless they ... So I start with this slide, which is, as I said, the title of this lecture as well. It's a type of manifesto. Maybe it's also a set of demands. It's very fuzzy. I go over those points in a little while. It's so a set of demands, really, and it was written in an attempt, you could say, to rescue architectural education from, and this sounds a little bit dramatic, but from irrelevance in a way. And when I talk about irrelevance, I mean the reduction of architectural services to this mere window dressing, which I've just talked about, that serves global capital in a way, and the commodification of buildings as real estate alongside that of other goods. No? So buildings are as much traded as is gold, as is other stuff, and it contributes massively to the wealth of a certain part of the population. And this particular text here in the picture now was written about 8 years ago, together with Alastair Parvin and Sam Brown. It was a couple of years into the most recent economic crisis, 2007, 2008, started back then. And as such, for us, was also a response to the immobility of architecture as a profession, as education, to respond to that crisis. No? So we were in the midst of a very deep economic recession. We're still in it, or we're still trying to get to grips with it in a way. But sort of 3 years into it, so 2011 or so, there were lots of reports, lots of things that actually explained how architecture was very much at the core of that crisis as well. The trading with architectural objects in a way was at the core of that crisis, but at the same time, none of my colleagues, hardly anyone in the profession was talking about that complicity in that crisis. This, in a way, was a response to what we saw, a failure of architecture to see itself as a crucial part in that situation that we were in. Architects, we felt, were happy to be bystanders, but failed to acknowledge that they had any role to play within this context. So, okay. So this text was triggered by an invitation to a debate a debate that was organized by a group called Project Orange at the School of Architecture in Sheffield, where I was teaching at the time. And for this debate, which for me is a very quintessential British format, you have a bit of a chamber, you have two sides in a room. One is arguing for, the other side is arguing against a certain arguments, and children train in school, especially the private establishments, to become very proficient in these formats. We were given, I was there, so with Alastair and Sam, and we were given the task to argue for why schools of architecture should be dissolved. And we took this to heart, but we also subverted this, and we subverted this by putting this little word "unless" under that statement. Because fundamentally, we do believe in schools of architecture, but not if they are educating for this kind of window dressing only. So I'm zooming into these statements a little so that you get a better idea of the things we put down. So we said, for example, architecture schools should be dissolved unless they abandon monovocationalism. And there's a little statement just next to all these things again. So we say, after the collapse of the construction bubble, architecture schools must prepare their graduates to apply design thinking and architectural intelligence in sectors beyond just the property and construction sector. We talked about promoting informed generalism, so that as much other knowledge as possible would be invited into your establishments, no? So that we actually also in schools of architecture talk about activism, we talk about sociology, we talk about politics and the relationship of architecture to those fields. We also saw that there wasn't really enough debate also happening in schools of architecture. So we said, no, let's encourage more debate about the things that are happening in the world. We said also something about realizing that the game has changed, and this is me also, I've alluded to this. No, architecture is no longer just about a set of beautifully designed buildings, or these kind of imaginary things that we do, but we need to look beyond this. Change the measures of success. There's so many architecture prizes that are given out to fantastical projects. Trout farms on Mars, I think at that time was one of our favorites. But it's we really wanted to look at the more nitty-gritty things that surrounded us. Take responsibility, and maybe one of the more contentious one is that architecture is not art. Art is art, design affects more than cultural discourse and is more than social engagement. Architecture is always connected also to social justice, and then also teach an expanded view of architecture and design. And this goes on. This is the second bit of demands further down. It's really about acting as agents for positive change in their host cities. It's about seeing our role as producing not just a new generation of graduates, but also a new generation of ideas. So it's not just about the people, but it's also about the things that we do. Seek to provide access to role models of all genders, races, and backgrounds. And this is something that is really this is something I'm really also very much concerned with, because if you look at your architectural history books and really examine who is in there and who is actually celebrated, it's still all very male, it's still very middle class, and this also continues into practice to this day. Okay, champion dropouts. Actively encourage and promote those students with a bravery to change their mind. A good architecture school should help students to do this, even if it's bad for the bottom line. Isn't that the ultimate purpose of education, that you actually find the things that you want to do? So with this in mind, with this kind of set of statements and demands in mind. This kind of backdrop of, I think, describes still quite well what I do, what I'm interested in, this kind of challenging of the things that we hold for granted, take for granted or so. I'm moving to the place where I've been teaching for the past year or so, where I said I'm leading this Institute for History and Theory of Architecture in the city. It's a department of architecture. There's about 1,000 students at this institution, bachelor and master. There's 15 institutes, smaller and larger units covering all aspects of architectural education. And this institute, and I'm mentioning this because it comes up later again, I'm one of 5 of these 15 institutes. There's about 5 academic staff beside me. There's about 7 or 8 students who work with us at any one time, and there's a sort of administrative person also who tries very hard to shield us from too much German university bureaucracy. So I'm part of a very big machinery, of a very big school of architecture, a technical university too, which comes with its very own set of demands, expectations and so on, which is something I don't really want to go into much today, but I want to tell you a little bit about the things that we do, and things that attempt to break this cycle of things that maybe lead to the problems I've started to outline. So architecture more or less being this kind of bystander in its own commodification by the real estate market, for example. Okay, good. So what do we do? We're interested in an engagement with cities and their people and places, and this includes human and non-human agents on multiple levels. And this very often means getting to know and becoming familiar with other places, so leaving school as much as possible. Sometimes this is further away from home than maybe just the city itself, but another city or another country. We're interested in how things work and who makes them work. So we're really interested in who makes buildings beyond the architect. So what are the decision-making structures? Who are or what are the politics actually that determine which buildings come up? Who makes the plans? These kind of bigger questions about who plans the planning. So it's not architects, it's not us who make these kind of decisions. Many decisions are made before you even think about taking a pencil into your own hand. This includes, however, also, we're interested in change. What drives change? What are the policies? What are the politics that drive change? What drives urban growth? What drives shrinking? And what are the consequences of urban change, urban transformation on common goods like water, electricity, mobility, planning, development, and also us within the city. So it's very much about people. And these topics translate within this university context into relatively standard teaching formats. So we don't sing much, we don't dance much. It's still lectures, it's still seminars, it's still, that might be organized a little bit differently, but it's relatively standard stuff. And students come for seminars, bachelor, master level. They can also do a project of their choice with us, and also come on field trips with us. And these relatively standard formats I've talked about attempt to do the following things. We're interested in making visible, so we're going away, we look at cities, we talk to people, we of course read and try to determine how situations come about, and we try to make this visible, because making visible for us, and making visible through writing, through drawing, through other means, making visible what, for example, makes a certain site a very contentious site, and making visible and sort of knowing what drives something helps you also to engage with this in a different way. We're generally interested in looking at this quite holistically, and the image I like to conjure up in this relation to making visible is that of an iceberg. No? So buildings are a little bit like the tip of an iceberg, or they're like mushrooms popping out of the ground. But what you really need to know with the iceberg as well, you know that only 1/10 is above the water level and 9/10 is below. And with mushrooms, you have these sort of rhizomatic networks that connect every single one. And there's a certain collective intelligence to those systems as well. So what interests me is what lies below. No? So I'm interested in these 9/10 of the iceberg and what is beneath the surface, or in the case of the mushrooms, I'm really interested in sort of the kind of networks and relationships that makes these things pop up. So this is what we're trying to do with buildings. We're trying to understand the networks and connections and things that sort of make buildings appear. Okay, why do we do this? Well, it's a very well-rehearsed argument in many sort of discourses. Here, I would maybe say that only when the field is known, so I talked about this in the context of making things visible, so only when the field is known, only when you know what that field is made out of, only when you know what all those different networks are that make a building, so only when you know what lies beneath this immediately sort of tangible landscape, can this landscape also be negotiated and can it also be changed. If you only know about the building at the top, you don't really know that much, but if you know what makes it and what makes it tick, what makes it go, and what the different elements are that establish that building, then I think you can begin to think about how to change things, how to do things in different manners. And this then speaks of that transformation of this hegemonial system I've mentioned in the beginning, that is clearly not benefiting the majority of the population, but only a few. And these buildings from Berlin, they speak a little bit to that context of urban change and what happens when we actually only look at what's on the surface. Okay, so just a few more things before I move on. So I talked about certain concerns that come out of that type of questioning, and that that relates to the exploitation of resources, and resources being obviously quite a big topic. But we could talk about energy, we could talk about material goods, we could talk about immaterial goods. We're interested in this kind of thing because we also see that this kind of window dressing I've talked about is not really addressing the growing inequalities that we've been experiencing. So I think that by looking at the world differently, at least we can begin to understand where those inequalities are coming from, and by knowing how they might emerge, we can also begin to change it. We are interested in also how certain planning decisions affect certain parts of the population exponentially. So women and children are typically worse off in urban transformations, but also when we talk about climate change, women and children are those groups of the population that are affected more than men. We're interested in housing and increasing housing affordability, and this is not just happening, I don't know, in Germany, in the UK, in France, in Austria. I'm not quite sure about the situation here, but it's relatively global. And of course, there's many, many more issues. And these questions are generally not seen within the realm of architecture. So this is probably not what you do. This is not what most schools of architecture do, that we look at these things in a more comprehensive manner. As I said before, we believe that looking at those things needs to be done in order to also change what actually pops out of the grounds. So these questions for us are fundamental spatial questions. Inequality, exploitation of resources, a climate crisis. They're not just things that will be negotiated in other realms. They will not just be negotiated by climate specialists or by sociologists or by politics, but I believe that architecture has a fundamental role to play in these discussions. We make choices for whom we work, what we might design, the materials we use in our buildings. These are all choices that can be made and that can have and can make a contribution also to addressing certain things. Certainly not all, but we can certainly contribute through various tools. Okay. Okay, so more concretely, and some photos from that kind of teaching activity, and it's reiterating some of the points I've been making. It's these are pictures from a recent field trip, and I've talked about how buildings are not necessarily the central focus of our teaching. They come up, but they are not in the center of our attention. What we really look at is how things are being made, and we have a particular interest in people, actually. So we go into the world and we speak to people and we find out what their issues are, what their problems are, what they are fighting with, what the things are that concern them, and how maybe the built environment that they live in contributes to these concerns or ameliorate those concerns. So we speak to people and listen to stories and write down those stories, but also connect stories. We connect to people who fight for the environment, who try to make it better, to improve environmental qualities, to improve economic qualities, to improve all sorts of conditions around them. We are interested in people who use design tools, or different kind of design tools, different systems, different sustainable building systems, people who think about the built environment in more holistic manners, people who do this bottom up or top down. I don't really care, I don't like these categories, but people who have an interest in improving the conditions of this, of Gaia, of our planet. And we're speaking to people who are developing also participatory planning methods, people who organize their environments less hierarchically, people who are concerned with equity, and so on and so forth. And what we're doing then is to attempt thinking things outside the box, also for saying that in order to develop different sensibilities for praxis, one needs to encounter also space differently. So I talked about these relatively standard formats that we follow, but I'm sort of an institute concerned with theory, but what we do is we cycle. We read texts on the outside. We don't sit in the library. We read them in public space. So it's challenging maybe these standard formats a little bit. We leave the classroom as much as possible. We change perspectives as often as possible. We change hats as much as possible, and we also encounter others as much as possible to sort of broaden our own horizon and our own perspectives. And this is important because sameness and lack of difference makes us also blind. No? If we spend too much time with the same kind of people in one room, we continue to say the same things over and over and over again, and only by going out will we actually be challenged about our own assumptions, why things are being made in certain ways. So homogeneity and too much sameness creates blindness, and it becomes impossible to see the truly important issues and what those issues are I've talked about earlier. So here it's trying to break open, sometimes for very brief moments, but sometimes also for very extensive periods, these normative and standard ways of doing. Cycling theory seminar for the city of Braunschweig, where we looked at housing projects. By cycling together, we spent a lot of time quite intensely together. We negotiated space with 40 bicycles or so, and we, on the way, developed also a common vocabulary to talk about a set of references around topics of property, ownership, and through these terms we could then also negotiate further actions and start other conversations. We talked about this. No? Architectural education is something that leaves the classroom as much as possible. Here we, this is a picture from a trip to Athens, where we looked at spaces of commoning. So spaces and places like health centers, social cultural centers, community centers, housing projects that have emerged over the past 10 years, you could say, as a result of the Greek government being close to bankruptcy, so also something that is linked intensely to the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, and in this context then the states bailing out, being bailed out by the European Union, which, and that state not just being lent money, but strings were attached. No? So the strings that were attached by the European governments when they lent money to Greece was about sort of reducing their debt by selling off public assets, selling off housing, selling off national monuments, everything that could be made into money, and these kind of things still cripple social and communal services. And what we then looked at was practices that have emerged in these cracks, practices that emerged in these fissures, and in very transformative and emancipatory manners sort of develop new forms of collectivity. So these became part of our focus of attention, and again, this is about leaving comfort zones, sort of questioning the kind of things that you take for granted, or things that you know how they should work, but sort of allowing other voices, other options, other models to come into our sets of references. It doesn't look like architecture, but in a way these kind of new forms of social organizations, they're also the starting point for new types of spaces to emerge. And these kind of things, this is something that goes like a red thread through almost everything we do, and this is another example of a recent encounter which sort of again breaks down this narrative character of learning, and we go out and we speak to people, we engage about historic sites of interest at the very location itself. So, and we meet people, and this understanding of space becomes then a shared practice, and also, in a way, production then is also being shared. So, I want to link this now to this project I mentioned earlier, spatial agency, other ways of doing architecture, which you might be familiar with, I'm not quite sure. But I do this also super briefly because it's situated in quite an extensive body of work, teaching and research that deals with ways of doing architecture that extend this notion of architecture as just being something very beautiful. And in my particular case, spatial agency was a continuation also of an intense interest of mine coming out of School of Architecture. I studied architecture, but for me it was a little bit designing by numbers. It was very functionalist. We got, I don't know whether you work with architects' data, Neufert. You do? You don't? Yes? Okay, this was the book I had to buy. It was the only book I had to buy. It was given to me in semester 1. My first year of architecture, and this is the book I sort of spent most of my time with. I bought the book, I took it to my room, and I hardly ever left the room again because everything that you needed to know was actually inside the book. So I'm not quite sure how you use it today, but in a way, you know, it became this kind of Bible, and for me also this kind of blueprint for non-engagement. Because obviously, if I wanted to know how high a chair is, how high a table is, how much space I need to sit you all in a lecture theater, or how much space I need to sit people around a dinner table, I could look it up in that bloody book. No? So it's this kind of thing that sort of, I don't know, made me nervous, made me quite nervous after a while, because I quickly thought this could not all be to, that there is to architecture. No? We can't all just be sitting somewhere and design spaces according to these dimensions that we find in that book. And became something that was really restrictive, and out of that I developed this kind of other interest in architecture, that interest that took me to that political side in a way, because I wanted to know where those dimensions were coming from, why someone actually took it upon himself to make those dimensions into that book that we still suffer under in so many ways. So what I did do was I left my room, I closed the book and put it to one side. I still have it, but I hardly ever look into it again. But I decided that I actually wanted to leave school and do other things, and wanted to look at what the real world looked like. You know? So I really wanted to measure myself in a way, what space was, and what space, the kind of spaces that I found around myself. So really sort of going out and expanding that horizon, and maybe also finding out whether the world was really as, in a way, fucked up as it is in that book. So I studied for a master in Glasgow, and the school really encouraged to think beyond those very sort of immediate functionalist concerns, and out of this we looked at the world. We looked, and this is a picture from Glasgow in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It still doesn't look much different, but no, we couldn't somehow, we were all architecture students, and we couldn't quite get together that kind of shiny, glossy world that we found in our magazines, and the world that we actually saw when we left our front doors, which was something like this. Yeah, so we went out, we started a workers' collective, an architectural cooperative, an architectural workers' cooperative, because we also wanted to, I don't know, set an example and say we're not like all these other architectural offices. We wanted to organize differently, but that's also quite another story. But in a way, this is where sort of this kind of interest in sort of reconciling the kind of world that is actually out there with the kind of architectural world began. And this kind of starting of the architectural workers cooperative, and at the same time, so we were out there and sort of trying to find explanations for why the world was looking like that, when our picture books in school had told us somewhat different things about the world. we also realized that there were not many more reference books. It was really difficult for us to find other examples, other practices, other people. So this is about 20 years ago now, who worked in similar ways. So and things have changed. The internet came along and it's become much easier to find these practices as well. But at that particular point, we were sort of a little bit stuck. We felt quite alone. And in a way, we said, well, this cannot be possible. There must be other people who are interested in sort of looking at the world in ways that we are interested in looking at the world, and this is where sort of also my interest in expanding architectural history books emerged, because for me it was really about, well, why couldn't I find something in my books about things like this? Why couldn't I learn about participation in one of my encyclopedias that I could find in the library? Why couldn't I find people who looked at architecture differently in the world that I found around myself? And this is when I started also to work with Jeremy Till, and we started this project, as I mentioned, Spatial Agency, Other Ways of Doing Architecture, where we began to also collate examples of these other ways of doing the kind of practices that address what I've been talking about earlier. Okay, good. And one of our big heroes, still, Second Prize, I see people recognizing him as well, also, maybe, I don't know. But Cedric Price was a part-time teacher also at the school I was at. He came for reviews, and he was someone who supported also this kind of work we were doing. And he himself, I guess, was very much also into this kind of looking at the world from a sort of a side, not straight on, but always questioning things from the side. And Price, who had been a mentor also for our setup of this cooperative, literally but also intellectually, was quite influential in then formulating this approach. So he was there and helped, but he also helped us to see that this kind of work with that cooperative was also good. It was really important to have a practice that made things visible in ways that other people might not make things visible. And it also allowed us to work with people and the city directly, but it also became increasingly necessary to find ways to reflect and step back, because when you're in the city, you're getting close, you're also building up relationships, you sometimes become too close, you become too enmeshed in certain systems, and you sometimes also lose that ability to reflect from those situations that you find yourself in. So what came out of this? Out of this discussion with him and this kind of practice was that we began also to look and find ways to retreat from those too close of an encounter, and to frame our actions within broader and wider contexts, both historical and also theoretical, to avoid a certain parochiality, to avoid self-centeredness, to and today maybe I would formulate this more strongly. I would say that without this occasional distancing and the exposure to criticality, to research, to others, and to reflection and so on, architectural education practice cannot really evolve, cannot progress beyond this immediacy that then again remains in the thrall of the most of its most direct environment and most direct forces. But there were also other reasons for wanting to zoom out and to take this work with class to another level, and to look, so to speak, onto practice from the outside, from other perspectives. And you see This work with a cooperative highlighted the necessity to work with the world, highlighted also the necessity to leave the much alluded to ivory towers of education and engage with the city. And yet, in a way, none of what we were doing. So we were doing all this interesting stuff, and it was really nice also to reflect back on it. But at the same time, we also began to look at this differently. And as I said, this became then the starting point to spatial agency, because we wanted to really also change what went into architecture history books, what went, the kind of monographs that we still have, what how architecture is reported on in journals, in newspapers, in the press around us. And there was, I guess there is still this mismatch between architecture's focus of attention on the one hand, and the issues and challenges that are necessary to address this on the ground. So I've talked about those issues before. I'll just give you these pictures again, so as a sort of a present day, sort of what are those issues that are still somewhat out there, still very much with us, and I still find are not being addressed. So there are these practices doing things otherwise, but in a way, I want to focus now on those concerns that they might be looking at. So I've talked about the housing crisis, deepening everywhere, for example, which is not contained to a few select locations. It's not India, it's not China, it's not the US or South America. It's this financialization of housing is sort of everywhere, and architecture has a very fundamental role to play. You might want to read Rainier Graf's book, Four Walls and a Roof, which highlights this kind of connection between capital and architecture and real estate, which unravels that quite nicely. So linked, as I said, a commodification of buildings and space, within which architects are very happy bystanders still. I've talked about climate crisis, and this is of course one. Maybe this is a resource crisis. I don't know, but obviously it also contributes to the climate crisis we find ourselves in, polluted environments. This is stuff that we have around us that we don't really necessarily consider as an architecture problem, but I think it is. I've talked about the multiple socio-spatial inequalities, and this is just an expression of and a real sort of reminder of what that looks like in many places around the world. This is Sao Paulo, where like in other places, it's sort of very it's very imminent, it's very there, but of course. We have these inequalities, maybe slightly less spatially obvious in places around the globe. Okay, then obviously complicity of planning in environmental degradation, whether that is through, as it's here in the picture, deforestation in order to aid urbanization. So this is a sort of a direct. This deforestation here is a direct result of rapid urban growth. So trees are taken down in order to allow cities to continue to grow. And I could also talk about the use of certain building materials, concrete being one of those big things. Concrete has a big component which is called sand. Where does the sand come from? I don't know. I don't know whether you look into this, but sand mining, especially illegal sand mining, is not just downright dangerous, because very often the sand is not properly dried before it goes into concrete, but very often it's also the wrong sand. So it doesn't have the same structural qualities. But it also contributes to environmental degradation, because people sort of take away whole beaches and other bits of the planet in order to make concrete, in order to build. I'm simplifying things, but I think you get the gist. And of course, it's about the participation. I've talked about this, and I could continue to talk about this for quite a while. In these kind of cities that are no longer really for people, so are no longer really for the people that we are and people that are around us, but buildings are being designed to be traded as real estate on some kind of markets. No? And this kind of stuff just gives me the creeps, when you sort of see something that is, well, something that an architect has designed, as here in the picture, but the only thing that comes out on those billboards is then that this building is an off-plan investment opportunity. No? So it's actually marketing the fact that people could buy a flat off-plan, so before the whole thing is being built, and I think it was within 3 or 4 years, you could get a 54% return on that thing. So it's not really about the people who are moving into these things. It's not really about people who really want to live in these things. It's people who want to buy something to make profit on architecture. So it's not really, not even the architects are profiting from this. It's people who have a lot of money who can buy flats. And who can then sit it out, wait a couple of years, and sell it then off for a lot more. And the real question that emerges here is then, if we only look at this building, of course we can critique its facade, we can look at the materials it's been built with, we could look at the spatial layouts and the floor plans, but this doesn't really tell us all about that story that architecture is part of. We really have to understand how buildings are financed in order to also be able to change how maybe cities are being produced, or whether cities are continuing to be these kind of real estate investment tools. So anyway, okay. And in the light of all this, taking account of our own respective histories, so this is back to spatial agency, this is this context within which we've worked, Jeremy and I, we looked at architecture that was a little bit more positive than the things I've been talking about. So people who took the environment at heart, people who really cared for social relations, people who cared for not just money, but creating things that mattered, that could last, that would not destroy the environment with every single bit they would do. And this is a website, you can check it out in your own time. Okay, spatial agency, I'm not really talking about the term, but it's quite a complex social science term, but it really is about sort of expanding the scope of architecture, not just looking at architecture as this building, but as something that is has more expanse, that is maybe also about knowledge, is maybe also about writing, is maybe also about engagement, is about all those things that I've been trying to talk about when I showed you those examples of my teaching practice. So look up the website if you want to. I was pondering over whether to show you photos of those practices or not, and I decided not to show pictures. You would have seen a huge variety of things, and you will see this when you look at these projects. You'll see projects with people, so pictures with people in them. You see books, you see publications, you see buildings that look a bit funny and would probably never get published in architectural magazines. There would be things that are permanent and not so permanent. Temporary and not so temporary, stuff that you might normally find in architecture books and stuff that you wouldn't. And you see from the list, maybe when you glance over it, that some of the names are still probably very familiar to you, but And since this has been published, I think some of those people really have also become quite substantial names in our field. But all of this, Spatial Agency says, is not only within the realm of architects and architecture's concern, but looking at this expanded focus is really a necessity in order to avoid this dissolution of architecture as I've talked about it. Why? Well, because these practices deal with those questions I've outlined. They look at how to organize space in a more fair manner. They produce things that explain processes that are otherwise hidden. They deal with the messiness of that world. They don't try to put order constantly upon other things. They speak to people, engage and co-develop ideas for how things could be organized differently. And I've talked about this awareness of building waste and other environmental degradation and so on and so forth. They speak to this concern of the wider world and not just to those who have privileged access to money and land. And they bring those issues forward, make them our concern, and highlight the capacity of architecture to engage with these issues. So before I conclude, just a few more things about this, how this relates to architecture education and possibly also other spatial disciplines. This might seem a little bit of a break, but I just want to go again over those things, and I want to put those things that I do. Many other of my colleagues are doing this. This understanding of architecture is this transformative tool into this context. So it's easy to dismiss those little architectural education exercises that I've talked about, and I do find myself doing exactly the same thing. This engagement with students of architecture, or the engagement that students of architecture have with me is almost minimal. It's bordering on the negligible. So it's at the school where I teach, 20 out of 100 credits, 180 credits go into history and theory, and 10 out of those 20 go into building history. So it's the antiques and up until the Middle Ages. So only 10 credits actually deal with, on a theoretical, historical level, with present-day conditions of and reflections on the city. So it's really negligible in a way. It's not even, it's 5% of the courses, and it's not much different in other schools of architecture. So I'm not saying that the students can't do critical thinking in other parts of their course, and you know that yourself. Whenever you want to do these kind of things, you also find the space to do it. But I think you also get my point when I say it's not in that kind of standard. When things like equality, equity, when things like the climate crisis are actually quite substantial parts of and will become ever more important parts of our lives over the next few years, to not have to deal with this seems to me almost, you could say criminal. Very little of the education system is in fact officially dedicated to those kind of ways of looking and concerning ourselves with the world. And whilst we get much noise to the otherwise, sort of when you look in books and so on and so forth, the design of buildings still occupy center of attention. And okay, and it's also easy, and I don't think I need to go over the reasons why buildings like this and other buildings are so attractive to sort of trained architects. We sort of see these bold shapes, and there's someone who's been commissioned by a really rich guy to make a really sort of fancy house, and there's sort of envy sort of coming out of architectural pores and in many parts. It's like everything is perfect, and the way these things are then also photographed. Everything is always perfect. The lawn is perfect, the sky is perfect, the shadows. Everything sort of in these things are perfect. And in a strange way, the building only really needs itself to shine. And too much of architecture education is still about this, and you look at the magazines, and again, I think you get the gist. I'm not saying that, addressing all that stuff that I've been talking about, sort of, you could call it the messy, the hairy, the complex, these kind of socio-spatial apparatuses, so the kind of stuff that is underneath the ground, that this is something that cannot be done in a way through a module, or through sort of architecture history and theory, but at the same time it's important also to not become complacent in these kind of discourses, to put things into context again and find ways of also linking these kind of discourses with other parts. Okay. And so I'm ending this, rambling through sort of architectural education and the kind of matters of concern, which is how Bruno Latour would maybe come in here as well, or at least I refer to those things as matters of concern. So I'm trying to put these together in those couple of slides that come now. They are 5 or 6 slides, and read them here as attempts to illustrate and to accompany this plea maybe for an architectural education that trains to care for things, and to care and to understand social, environmental, as well as economic challenges. So the kind of challenges I've outlined in the beginning. So take this slide here as a reminder about the fact that many of those challenges cannot be learned or experienced by remaining in the classroom. So leave as much as you can. We have to go out in order to experience the world. And this picture is a plea for recognizing the necessity to link theory also to the real world. It doesn't really. You can't read your books in class, take them out, read them on a park bench, read them in a public park, read them to other people that you might encounter and see how relevant they are to them, and then take those things back into class with them. Take this slide here as a maybe call to maybe a need or a plea to complexify also things. Things are complex, things have to be complex, things also have to be displayed in a much more complex manner. We need to get away from these kind of learned practices of sort of reducing knowledge into black lines on white paper with a few sort of shaded areas on top. This is not what the world is. The world is messy, it's hairy, it's not neat, it's really complex, it's deeply political. And to sort of get this kind of acknowledgement also into your drawings, I think is one way of beginning to understand what you're actually dealing with when you go out. So acknowledging those experiences also, not taking them seriously, not reducing them to sort of these kind of lines, I think is really important. Okay, and then take this slide, which for me also stands as a kind of reminder that we can also use polemic and wit in a way to question the kind of words that we use to describe certain things. This is really about, what actually is architecture? When we talk about these terms like shelter and memory, and we talk about openness, but what does it actually mean? And think about other ways of sort of also transporting those ideas and sort of describing things, whilst at the same time also understanding the inextricable, maybe inevitable interlocking between the making of space and also finance. So here we did actually sell architecture. We sold door openers, we sold umbrellas, we sold memory, so those quintessential architectural things, but they don't really look like architecture. And this slide here, and you saw that in the beginning, this kind of manifesto or set of statements, take it as a reminder of the potential of institutions also to foster different kinds of relationships between architects as citizens and their environments. And let's not forget that processes that are started in education have an influence on the self-understanding of the architecture profession and the kind of work he or she will do and whom for. And I'll end this tour de force with a quote. This very tiny quote in the bottom right corner by the architect Sarah Wigglesworth, in which she talks about how we are what we build and how what we build shows who we are and what we believe in. You know, so she says the environment is a ubiquitous expression of our values. It says something about who we are and in what we believe. And so this is a plea to you as future architects, practitioners, or whatever you might become, dropouts, I don't care, going into the world, to take on this expanded field of architectural and broader spatial practice and to continue to contribute, shift and transform those limiting and downright dangerous, narrowing architectural debates and practices. And let's engage also more systematically with tools, instruments, and whatever it might take that create different sensibilities towards the real challenges of this world, and in turn also different futures. So this is me, thank you.